The courtroom smelled faintly of dust and coffee. I remember staring at the clock above the bench, its second hand dragging like it too was tired of waiting. The judge cleared his throat. "Mr. Keene, your $4 million account is now frozen pending federal review." The words landed like a door slamming shut. Thomas's fingers tightened around the edge of the defense table. He was still wearing the same suit he used to charm investors. His skin looked pale under the fluorescent lights, and when he turned toward me for the first time in years, he didn't smile. The courtroom murmured. His attorney leaned in, whispering something frantic, but all I saw was the reflection of myself in the glass divider, calm, steady, unshaken. People think revenge is loud. It isn't. It's measured. It's documented. It has receipts. 2 years earlier, he had said, "For our future baby, trust me." He'd brushed my hair back and kissed my forehead like a man who meant well. That line became the hinge on which my entire life turned. I didn't know then that our future would become a ledger, every lie an entry, every broken promise accruing interest. I was 56 when I learned that love could look like theft disguised as protection. The judge's voice brought me back. "Mrs. Whitaker, did you know about these transfers?" I didn't blink. "Not until the audit, Your Honor." Thomas's lawyer stood his tone sharp. "She planned this. She's been setting him up for years." My breath stayed even. "No," I said. I calculated it. There was a silence so complete it felt like the air itself stopped to listen. Somewhere behind me, a reporter's pen clicked. Outside the courthouse, the air shimmered with early summer heat. Cameramen weighted lenses pointed at the glass doors. Inside, Thomas stared at the table as the judge signed the order that froze every account, every property, every shell company he thought I would never find. I used to believe that justice was a moment, a gavel, strike a single verdict. But it isn't. It's a slow accumulation, like compound interest, quiet but relentless. And it always matures. 2 years before I'd trusted him with my savings, my mother's life insurance, my half of the house, he'd said we were building something. He'd said, "You shouldn't worry about money, Diane. That's my job." The kind of sentence that sounds romantic until it isn't. He was good at those. I'd met Thomas Keene at church at the hospital fundraiser after my mother's stroke. He'd helped me write a check when my hands were shaking. "You deserve a man who takes care of things," he'd said. The words fell into me like medicine. I'd been so tired then, tired of bills, tired of the quiet sound of machines keeping my mother alive. So when he took my hand, when he smiled and said, "I'll make sure she never worries again," I wanted to believe him. I wanted to stop being the one who balanced everything. But men like Thomas never mean protection. They mean possession. When my mother died, he handled the funeral, every invoice, every call, every signature. I didn't notice the charges then. I didn't ask about the extra zeros. I thought grief excused everything. I told myself love was trust, and trust I learned was the most expensive currency. Now, standing in that courtroom, I realized he had written our story like an accountant, with a false bottom line, shifting numbers, moving funds, leaving me holding empty accounts. But he forgot one thing. I'm an accountant, too. I don't forget where numbers go. His lawyer tried again. "Mrs. Whitaker, are you satisfied with this outcome?" "Satisfied," I repeated. "No, I'm reconciled." Reporters followed me down the courthouse steps. Microphones stretched forward like spears. "Is this revenge?" one asked. I looked straight into the lens. "No," I said. "It's interest accrued over time." Flashbulbs exploded. Somewhere behind me, I heard Thomas's voice breaking his expensive shoes, scraping the marble floor. But I didn't turn around. Justice doesn't need witnesses to feel real. It just needs a balance to settle. As I walked to the parking lot, I remembered the first check I ever wrote for him. It was for $5,000. Just a short-term transfer, he'd said. I'd written the memo line myself, "For our future." That line still exists, printed in neat blue ink on a copy I keep in a folder labeled Evidence. I never crossed it out. I wanted to remember that once I believed him, that once I confused care with control. People think stories like mine end in shouting or broken plates. They don't. They end in paperwork, in quiet rooms, in signatures that restore what was taken. They end when the woman who was supposed to stay silent decides to speak in the language her oppressor understands best, records forms, balance sheets. When I slid into my car that afternoon, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt accurate. And that's all I'd ever wanted to make the math of our life finally add up. I met Thomas Keene in the spring of 2016 inside the small Methodist church, where the fluorescent lights always flickered during Sunday service. My mother had been moved to the hospice wing that week, and I spent most mornings balancing invoices from the hospital on the wooden pew. Numbers kept me grounded. They were clean, obedient, exact. Grief wasn't. Thomas appeared with the calm confidence of someone who had never stood next to a billing desk. He wore a pressed blue shirt, no tie, and offered to help me fill out a wire transfer form. "You deserve a man who takes care of things," he said, his voice warm and low like a practiced reassurance. I remember thinking he sounded like safety. That was my first mistake. He showed up at the hospital 2 days later with coffee and flowers for my mother. She liked him instantly. "That one has good hands," she whispered, her voice brittle but amused. He leaned over her bed and promised he'd drive me home so I could sleep. That night, he stayed outside the house until the porch light went out. Over the next few months, he became the kind of man every friend calls a blessing. He fixed leaky faucets, organized medication, even helped me handle the insurance paperwork that had been buried under grief. I didn't see the pattern then. Every act of kindness was also a step closer to control. He learned the passwords to my accounts because I was too tired to manage them. He added his name to my utilities because we might as well simplify. I let him. I thought that's what partnership meant. Ease shared burden. Less math in my head. 6 months later, on a rainy evening in October, he knelt by my mother's hospital bed with a small velvet box. "I'll make sure she never worries again," he said. My mother smiled through tears. I said yes because she was watching. I said yes because I was lonely. I said yes because I didn't know that trust can sometimes look like paperwork waiting to betray you. We married that winter in the same church, simple vows and cheap champagne. My mother passed 3 weeks later. At the funeral, Thomas stood tall, shaking every hand, thanking the guests for coming, as if it were his stage. He looked like a man holding the family together. In truth, he was already prying it apart. After the burial, he suggested setting up a small joint account to manage Mom's hospital refunds and estate bills. It sounded reasonable. He promised transparency. I signed the papers without reading them closely. "You're an accountant, Diane," he said, laughing. "You check everything twice." I smiled, not realizing that I hadn't checked him once. In the first few months, he called the bank, often asking about transfer limits, overdraft, protection tax deductions. He used the word "we" for every decision, but the statements started arriving in his name only. I noticed it one afternoon while sorting the mail. The bank logo glared at me like a warning I wasn't ready to hear. When I asked, he said it was a system glitch. "Don't worry, babe. I handle these things." He was gentle, affectionate, tired-looking. Guilt is persuasive when it comes with soft eyes. My friends adored him. "You finally found someone who gives as much as you do," they'd say. I wanted them to be right. I wanted to believe that I wasn't repeating my mother's mistake, trusting charm over consistency. A few weeks later, he started visiting the hospital billing office alone. "You shouldn't have to deal with this," he said. "I'll close everything up." I didn't question him, though. I did wonder why the account balances never matched the receipts. Once, while sorting through documents, I found an unfamiliar email address printed under a payment confirmation. It read TK Financial Assistance. I thought maybe the hospital had outsourced payments. I didn't realize he had opened a secondary account, one I couldn't access, using both our initials. The first real crack appeared when a bill collector called asking about a payment discrepancy. They claimed a duplicate transfer had been made. I confronted Thomas that night over dinner. He smiled, cutting into his steak, and said, "Oh, that's just a system error. I'll handle it tomorrow." He poured me wine before I could ask again. That's how he always ended questions, with hospitality. My mother's house sold a month later. He handled the paperwork. When the check arrived, I watched him deposit it into the joint account. He kissed my forehead and said, "For our future." I didn't know that by our, he meant his. The moral arithmetic of that year still haunts me. He gave kindness the shape of duty, and I mistook it for love. Every good act had a cost, and every cost was hidden in fine print. When the hospital finally sent the final reconciliation, I noticed something strange. The totals didn't match what Thomas had told me. The difference wasn't small, it was thousands. I confronted him again. He looked tired, then offended. "Diane, are you accusing me of stealing from your dead mother?" The words felt like a slap, not for their cruelty, but for how easily they fit his mouth. I apologized. He forgave me like a saint. That night he came to bed late and whispered, "You really have to learn to trust me." I said nothing. But the next morning I made a copy of every statement and hid them in a file labeled House Records, Love. I realized later is just another form of accounting. You measure what you give, what you owe, what you lose. But unlike numbers, people can lie. They can zero out the truth. One Sunday afternoon, I caught him on the phone using a tone he never used with me, low-efficient transactional. I only heard a few words: wire transfer. Same routing as before. Same. When I stepped into the room, he smiled and said, "Just business." I should have asked. I should have walked away then. But when someone wraps deceit in tenderness, the mind takes longer to balance the books. The last entry in that year's ledger is the day he brought home flowers for no reason. He said, "For us, for how far we've come." I smiled, though I couldn't remember moving forward at all. I placed the bouquet on the kitchen counter beside the unopened envelopes from the bank. Later, when I finally opened them, I understood the pattern deposits, shrinking withdrawals disguised as property maintenance transfers, labeled medical. That night, I sat at the dining table and wrote a note to myself: audit everything. I didn't know it then, but that would become my prayer, my revenge, and my deliverance. After my mother's funeral, Thomas became a kind of local saint. Everyone called him the man who took care of everything. He ordered the flowers, managed the catering, wrote the obituary, even stood at the pulpit, reading a passage from Corinthians with a voice that trembled in all the right places. People whispered that I was lucky to have him. I nodded and smiled. In truth, I was too exhausted to notice the numbers changing beneath the surface of our lives. He visited the cemetery every Sunday and brought roses. He told me he wanted to keep her memory alive. I believed him until the day I noticed the charge on my credit card statement. It read, Hillcrest Florals, weekly subscription. The card number was mine. I asked him about it. He laughed and kissed my cheek. "Babe, we share everything." "Why does it matter whose card it is?" I said nothing. But that night, I wrote a small note in my ledger. Thomas's version of grief equals retail therapy. A month later, I found another receipt, this one from a tuxedo rental shop. He had worn that suit to the funeral, then never returned it. The late fee was charged to our joint account. When I asked him why he hadn't returned it, he smiled. I was planning to buy it. I looked good in it, didn't I? That was the first time I laughed at his arrogance. It sounded hollow. I began to understand that Thomas's generosity always came with a hidden invoice. When the funeral home sent the final bill, I felt a chill. The total was almost twice what they had quoted me. I called the office and spoke with the director. "We already received full payment," he said. "Your husband handled it. He emailed me a copy of the invoice. It showed charges for premium caskets, imported flowers, live musicians. My mother had wanted a simple service. She'd asked for one song, one speech, and one white lily." I stared at the document, realizing he had inflated the bill, then paid it using our joint account. He had literally turned my mother's death into a profit margin. When I confronted him, he looked hurt. "Diane, I did it for her. She deserved better. I felt a flicker of guilt for questioning him. That was his power he made doubt feel like cruelty. "You're unbelievable," I said. "You don't understand sentiment," he replied softly, like a priest absolving me of sin. Later that night, he brought me tea and apologized for making me feel bad. "I just wanted everything to be perfect," he said. His charm was anesthesia. It numbed me long enough for the next lie to take root. Over the following months, Thomas built a reputation as the perfect son-in-law. He dropped by the church to donate in my mother's name. He posted photos online of her gravestone surrounded by flowers. Everyone adored him. I heard one of the church ladies say, "That man worships his wife's mother more than his own." I smiled politely. Inside, I felt something twist. He was buying moral credit with my money. I started keeping small notes, nothing formal, just fragments on sticky pads tucked inside my planner. Double charge on funeral. Florist subscription. Casket upgrade. The numbers didn't matter yet, but the pattern did. I didn't know it then, but I was already building the first layer of what would become my case file. By summer 2018, I noticed he no longer said we. It became I paid, I handled, I arranged. The plural dissolved as easily as my trust. He'd begun staying out late, claiming work meetings. He worked in sales, though I never quite understood what he sold. Once I asked, and he said solutions. That was Thomas, in one word, a man who sold solutions to problems he quietly created. One evening I found him sitting on the porch reading old sympathy cards. He looked at me and said, "Your mom really loved me." I wanted to ask if that's why he used her death as a line item on our budget, but I didn't. Instead, I poured us wine. He raised his glass. "To family," he said. The word sounded like an inside joke. Weeks later, while filing paperwork for tax season, I found a discrepancy in the joint account. There was a transfer labeled estate maintenance that didn't match any invoice. I printed the statement and slipped it into a folder. When I showed it to him that night, he shrugged. I moved it temporarily to cover a client project. I asked, "Whose client?" He smiled. "Ours." The irony of an accountant being gaslit about numbers wasn't lost on me. I started triple-checking everything. Each time I asked for an explanation, he turned it into an accusation. "You don't trust me," he'd say, sounding wounded. "After everything I've done for your family." The phrase "your family" began to sting. My family was gone. What remained was a balance sheet full of his fingerprints. On the first anniversary of my mother's passing, he arranged a memorial dinner. He invited friends, neighbors, even the pastor. He gave a speech about her generosity, then presented a check to the church in her honor. The audience applauded. The check, of course, was from our joint account. I watched him bask in the attention. When the pastor thanked him, he turned to me smiling as if to say, "See, I'm the good one." That night, while he slept, I went through his desk drawers. I found a small stack of receipts tucked inside an envelope labeled donations. Half were legitimate. The others were forged. The handwriting was his, a neat imitation of mine. I should have confronted him then, but something inside me shifted. Silence became my strategy. If he wanted a performance, I'd give him an audience. I'd nod, smile, and let him believe I was still under his spell. Every good accountant knows you never reveal the audit before it's complete. I started recording details in a small notebook I kept hidden inside an old cookbook. Each entry had 2 columns: what he said and what actually happened. I called it the Good Son Ledger. It wasn't about revenge yet. It was about clarity. My mother had once told me, "The dead teach us the value of silence." I finally understood what she meant. Sometimes silence isn't submission, it's calculation. As the months passed, his good son act grew sloppier. He'd come home late smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. He started boasting about helping other people with finances. Once I heard him on the phone saying, "Don't worry, my wife's an accountant. I know how to make it look clean." That night, I stared at him across the dinner table, wondering if he even remembered who he used to pretend to be. The night he forgot our anniversary, he brought flowers as an apology, the same kind he bought for my mother's grave. I looked at them and thought, He doesn't even change the bouquet. I smiled anyway. The performance continued. Inside, something cold and precise had taken shape. I wasn't just balancing our accounts anymore. I was balancing the truth. And soon the numbers would turn against him. Our second anniversary arrived in the early spring of 2018. Austin was warming up the kind of soft heat that makes people generous and tired at once. I had just finished the quarterly audits at my firm and received a bonus $7,800 after taxes. It was the first time in months I had money that felt like mine. I wanted to mark the occasion with something meaningful, something that said we had made it through the hardest years. I chose a Rolex Oyster stainless steel classic face, the kind of watch a man keeps for life. When I handed him the small box over dinner, his eyes widened with the same practiced wonder he used at every surprise. "You did this for me," he said, smiling like a commercial husband. "I'll wear it every day." I believed him because I still wanted to. He wore it constantly for a week. He lifted his wrist to show people, said things like, "My wife knows quality." I liked hearing the word wife said with pride. It made the ledger of our marriage feel balanced for a moment. But numbers, like people, always reveal their truth with time. 1 month later, while sorting through the mail, I found an unfamiliar envelope from Capital Pawn and Jewelry. I thought it was junk. I almost threw it away. Then I saw the words, Rolex Oyster, loan amount $3,000. My stomach tightened. I checked the serial number. It matched. He had pawned the watch. I felt my pulse rise, but my face stayed still. Years of accounting taught me that emotion clouds precision. I waited until dinner. "How was work?" I asked. "Busy," he said. A client lunch ran late. He poured himself wine. I placed the envelope on the table. He glanced at it, smiled. "Oh, that. Just temporary. Investment strategy, babe." He said it like it was clever, like pawning a gift was part of some grand financial plan. "We needed short-term liquidity," he added. I stared at him. "We have savings." He shrugged. "I'll get it back next week. Don't overthink it." I didn't raise my voice. I just nodded. Right? Short-term. Inside, I was already running numbers. How many lies fit inside one balance sheet? How many gifts were already gone? When he left for his client meeting the next day, I opened my laptop and started taking inventory not of possessions, but of control. First, I changed every password connected to my personal accounts. He would notice eventually, but not right away. Then I redirected my payroll deposit to a small credit union 2 blocks from my office. They still used paper forms, the kind of bureaucracy Thomas hated. I liked that. I also opened a new savings account in my maiden name under a branch code he had never seen. For the memo line, I wrote 2 words, contingency fund. That night, I sat in the quiet living room and made a folder on my desktop. I named it File 19. It sounded clinical, harmless. Inside, I copied every transaction from our joint accounts for the past 6 months. I highlighted the ones that didn't match receipts. There were more than I expected. When I finished, I leaned back and said out loud, "He collects watches. I collect receipts." The sentence made me laugh softly. It felt like the first honest joke I'd told in years. A week later, I asked him about the watch again. "You got it back?" He nodded quickly, too quickly. "Of course, I told you just temporary." I studied his wrist. The Rolex was there, but the second hand didn't move. It was dead. "Battery issue," he said, sliding his sleeve down. That night, I found the pawn ticket in his drawer. The watch was still at the shop. The one on his wrist was a cheap replica, $40 from an online retailer. I stared at it under the lamplight and realized the symbolism was almost poetic. Our marriage looked expensive from afar, but up close it was imitation. He started spending more evenings out after that. Networking, he said. Investors love personal contact. I didn't argue. I was busy anyway, busy reconciling, documenting, preparing. Every lie became a line item, every evasion an asset waiting to mature. I began to see the humor in it. I even started leaving small notes for myself hidden in plain sight audit ongoing interest compounding. It amused me to speak in his language but mean something entirely different. One night he came home late and asked why the Wi-Fi password had changed. I told him the router company forced an update. He believed me. He always believed me because he thought deceit was his exclusive skill. A few days later, while making breakfast, he handed me a bouquet of roses. "You're quiet lately," he said. "Everything okay?" I smiled. "Perfect," I replied. "Everything is balancing out." He laughed, thinking it was a joke. Around that time, I started noticing new patterns in his spending. Charges from bars, boutique hotels, gas stations, miles away. Nothing extravagant, just subtle inconsistencies that spoke louder than any confession. I didn't confront him. I just added a new tab to File 19 labeled Behavioral Notes. My handwriting grew steadier with each entry. One Saturday morning, while he was in the shower, his phone buzzed on the nightstand. A text preview flashed, "Thanks again for the weekend." No name, just a number. I didn't open it. I didn't need to. The emotional math was complete. I walked to my desk, opened File 19, and wrote the final line for that month, asset depreciating rapidly. Humor became my shield. At dinner parties, when friends asked how we were, I said, "We're investing in new ventures." They laughed, not knowing how accurate that was. He was investing in lies. I was investing in evidence. By the end of that spring, I had established my own quiet system. Separate savings, documented proof, new financial boundaries he didn't even know existed. When he boasted about his business success, I smiled and mentally assigned it a category fictional revenue. The Rolex remained in the pawn shop for months. Eventually, the store called me because the account was still under my address. "Are you planning to reclaim it?" the clerk asked. "No," I said. "Consider it written off." It felt strangely satisfying to say that. Some losses are worth keeping as reminders. That night, I poured a glass of wine and sat by the window. Outside, the streetlight flickered the same way it had the day I met him. I thought about how small moments repeat until you learn their meaning. He had once told me I was lucky to have a man who managed things. Now I understood that management was just a polite word for manipulation. I closed my laptop, whispered to the dark room, "short-term liquidity," and laughed quietly. Then I added a note to my ledger, contingency established, interest rising. By the start of 2019, the silence in our house had become a kind of cold arithmetic. Every conversation was a calculation, every touch a transaction. Thomas still called me babe and still claimed to be working late, but I had stopped checking. Instead, I began building something of my own. It started small, a simple binder I kept in the bottom drawer of my filing cabinet at work. I labeled it Whitaker Binder. The name made me smile. It sounded harmless domestic like a recipe book, but it was my quiet war plan. I divided it by color blue for bank records, yellow for property, red for hidden debts. Each page was a puzzle piece, each receipt a weapon waiting for its moment. The blue section came first. I printed every statement from the joint account for the last 2 years. At night, while Thomas slept, I highlighted each unexplained withdrawal. Some went to online vendors I'd never heard of. Others were payments to a company called TK Investments, LLC. I checked the state registry. The LLC was real, but the registered agent was not Thomas Keene. It was a woman named Chelsea Moore. I didn't know her. I would later learn she was one of his clients. For now, all I knew was that the company had received over $30,000 in supposed consulting fees from our account. The invoices were polished but generic, no project names, no dates, just services rendered. The yellow section came next. It contained the house deed car title and property tax statements. I began noticing small discrepancies, addresses that didn't match signatures that looked rushed. Thomas had refinanced one of our properties using both our names but only deposited half of the payout into our joint account. The other half had vanished into TK Investments. I didn't confront him. I just kept adding to the binder page by page until the stack became heavy enough to feel like justice taking shape. The red section came last. It was for debts I hadn't known existed. One evening, I received a letter from a credit card company I'd never applied to. The balance was $12,000. The account was in my name but sent to his business address. When I called the bank, the representative said, "Oh yes, Mrs. Keene, this card was added as an authorized user by your husband." I hung up slowly, feeling the old ache in my chest return. Not heartbreak, but clarity. That night, I set the binder on the kitchen table and poured myself a glass of iced coffee. I looked at it the way a general looks at a map. I wasn't just documenting lies anymore. I was drawing the battle lines. The next morning, over breakfast, Thomas bragged about his new tax strategy. He said he had filed our joint return early and saved us $10,000. "I'm practically a financial genius," he said, smiling. I sipped my coffee. "You filed already." He nodded. "Handled everything. You can thank me later." I smiled back. "You're efficient." What he didn't know was that I had already filed my own return 2 weeks earlier. I had switched my filing status to married filing separately without telling him. I had reported every account in my name, but none of his deductions. It was the first silent move in what would become a very public audit. A month later, he came home waving a letter. "They're reviewing my return," he said. "Just routine." I glanced at the envelope. The logo read, "Internal Revenue Service." I hid my grin behind the rim of my coffee mug. "Routine is good," I said. He shrugged. "They probably just want to see how I saved us so much." I nodded. "You saved us $10,000. Impressive." Then I whispered just loud enough for myself to hear, "You also gained an audit." From that moment, the paper war escalated. I started scanning every piece of mail before he could open it. I set up a P.O. box under my maiden name for any correspondence I didn't want him to see. My evenings became rituals of quiet rebellion, printer humming, binder expanding, evidence growing. One night, Thomas noticed the binder on my desk. "What's that?" he asked. "Work project," I said. "Just reconciliations." He nodded, uninterested. He never looked twice at numbers unless they benefited him. By midsummer, the IRS sent a second notice to Thomas. He looked nervous. "They want documentation of my business deductions," he said. "They're questioning TK Investments." He chuckled like it was a joke. "Probably just bureaucracy." I asked, "Who's Chelsea Moore?" He froze for half a second before recovering. "Just a contractor." "Why?" I shrugged. "Her name keeps showing up on our bank statements." He smiled thinly. "You really should let me handle finances. Numbers stress you out." I returned his smile. "You're right. They do." That night, I added a note to the blue section of the binder, "Confidence equals currency." I began creating a timeline of every suspicious transaction. It covered 3 years and filled 20 pages. For each item, I attached proof bank screenshots, email printouts, and in some cases, copies of his own texts. I stored the binder in a locked drawer at the office. It became a secret I loved more than any affection he had left to offer. Humor kept me sane. Sometimes I'd imagine the IRS agent reviewing his return pen, poised over the numbers he'd invented. I pictured their confusion when they realized his deductions made no mathematical sense. Charitable donation, $10,000, consulting expense, undefined. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. At home, Thomas remained confident. "You know, Diane," he said one night, "if we play this right, we'll be retired by 55. I smiled. "You think so?" "Absolutely," he said. "I've got a plan." "I bet you do," I replied. I knew he suspected nothing. He was too accustomed to being admired to imagine being studied. But I was studying him the way a forensic accountant studies a failing corporation. I saw the patterns: overconfidence concealment, small lies scaling into large ones. One afternoon, I called my old colleague Marlene, who had moved to the IRS office downtown. I didn't tell her everything, just enough to raise an eyebrow. If a person is funneling joint assets into an LLC under a false agent, what's the likely consequence? I asked. She paused. Felony tax evasion if proven. I thanked her, hung up, and wrote one final note in red ink: paperwork equals power. Weeks later, Thomas celebrated solving his audit. He walked into the kitchen holding another letter. "They cleared me," he said proudly. I asked to see it. He handed it over. The letter didn't say cleared. It said further documentation required. I looked up at him, smiling gently. That's wonderful news. He frowned. You didn't read it. I trust you, I said. The irony tasted sweet. That evening, while he sat watching television, I added the letter to the binder and slid it shut. My collection was almost complete. Sometimes people think revenge is an explosion, but for me it was quiet paper, moving through quiet rooms. Every signature, every receipt, every discrepancy whispered the same truth. He had built his empire on my patience, and patience, when compounded, is the most dangerous form of interest. I closed the binder and whispered to the empty room. Ever smiled through someone's lie just to watch it mature into proof? Then I smiled again because I already knew the answer. By early 2020, Thomas decided it was time to play the role of a generous husband again. He came home one Friday night holding a set of car keys, dangling them like a magician, revealing his final trick. Surprise, he said, grinning. You've been working too hard. You deserve something nice. In the driveway sat a new black SUV gleaming under the porch light. The dealership tag still hung from the mirror. It was the kind of car that said success, stability, safety. I wanted to believe it was real. He wrapped his arm around me. Paid in full, he said proudly. Consider it my gift. I smiled, nodded, thanked him, and drove it the next morning. It even smelled like sincerity. For a few weeks, I let myself enjoy the illusion. I parked it at work, washed it every Saturday, took long drives on the weekends, just to feel movement again. But good things with Thomas always came with a balance due. The bill arrived a month later in the mail, a thin white envelope addressed to him. Inside was a payment notice from the financing company. I read it twice, then a third time. The loan was under his name, but the car title listed him as the sole owner. My signature wasn't anywhere. He had bought the car using our joint account for the down payment, but registered it as his asset. In legal terms, it was his car paid with my money. That night, I left the letter on the counter. Oh, that he said when he saw it. Yeah, I put it under my name for simplicity. You know how dealerships are. I folded the paper. So the car is yours. He smiled. Ours, he corrected. It's just paperwork, Diane. Don't be dramatic. Paperwork, I thought, was his favorite disguise for deceit. I drove the SUV anyway, quietly aware that every mile was technically borrowed. But then, the second letter came a late payment notice. He had missed 2 installments. You forgot this, I said, handing it to him. He laughed. It's automatic. Probably a system error. I checked the account. No payment had been made. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about the years of signatures and transactions that had tied me to him like invisible strings. If he wanted to turn gifts into debts, I would learn how to turn debts into freedom. The next morning, I called the financing company. Can a spouse make payments on a vehicle registered to their partner? I asked. Yes, the clerk replied, as long as you have access to the loan number. I smiled. Perfect. Over the next few months, I made every remaining payment myself, quietly, methodically rounding each figure to the nearest cent. Each time I clicked, confirm, I wrote a small note in my ledger, interest accumulating. When the final statement arrived, I visited the county tax office. The clerk asked if I was applying for a title transfer. Spousal, I said. She nodded and handed me the form. Texas law allowed a loophole for vehicles considered community property. If one spouse paid the full amount and the other signed a waiver, ownership could be transferred. It required a single notarized signature. I had one. Thomas had signed it years earlier for insurance purposes. I retrieved the document from the Whitaker binder, smiling as I realized he had unknowingly signed away his claim before the game even started. The transfer took 20 minutes. When it was done, the clerk stamped the new title and slid it across the counter. Congratulations, she said. It's officially yours. I thanked her, stepped outside, and stood in the sunlight for a long time. The SUV glimmered like a quiet victory. I drove home with the window down the title, sitting on the passenger seat like a co-conspirator. That evening, Thomas was in the garage polishing his golf clubs. "You took the car today?" he asked. "Yep," I said. "Just to run errands." "Good," he said. "Keep it clean. That car's an investment." I almost laughed. "Oh, it's safe," I replied. "Very well protected." 2 weeks later, another letter arrived this time, confirming the account closure. He opened it at the kitchen table and frowned. "What's this?" "They sent the title." "They must have finished processing," I said, sipping my coffee. He flipped through the pages. His name was gone. Mine stood alone. His face drained of color. "Why does it say your name?" he asked. "Because it's mine," I said gently. "I paid it off. You used my account." "Our account," I corrected. "Community property. Remember that phrase." He blinked, trying to process the arithmetic of betrayal. "You tricked me." "No," I said. "I just finished what you started." He slammed the papers on the table. "You can't just take my car." I stood, picked up the envelope, and tucked it into the binder I had brought to the living room. "I didn't take it," I said. "I earned it." He stared at me, lost for words. "You're unbelievable." I smiled faintly. "That's what you said the first time you lied about my mother's funeral bill." That night, he stomped around the house, muttering about betrayal. I stayed in the study updating File 19. Under the new section, Assets Recovered, I wrote SUV paid in full, titled in my name. He gifted me debt. I gifted him paperwork. Humor softened the edges of my anger. It became my private soundtrack. When he bragged to friends about how good he was with money, I would smile across the table and think, "You have no idea how audited your life is." The following week, he tried to call the dealership. "We need to reverse this," he told them. They explained the transaction was legal and final. He paced the kitchen, shouting into the phone, then slammed it down. "You're vindictive," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm thorough." I started driving the SUV everywhere. I took the long route to work, stopped for coffee, just because I could left my favorite playlist running while I parked. Every mile felt like a small repayment for years of quiet humiliation. Each time I adjusted the rearview mirror, I saw not just my reflection, but a woman who had finally learned to calculate her own worth. One evening, he tried to bring it up again. "You really think a car makes you the winner here?" he said. I looked at him and smiled. "No," I said. "The paperwork does." After that, he stopped mentioning it. But I could feel the resentment simmering beneath his silence. It was the beginning of his unraveling, though he didn't know it yet. The man who once prided himself on control was now surrounded by invisible walls of documentation he couldn't breach. I added one last note to the binder that week. Paper cuts may be small, but they bleed slowly. It made me laugh again. Revenge didn't have to roar. Sometimes it just needed a stamp, a signature, and a woman who knew how to read fine print. The official audit began on a Wednesday morning in May 2021. The summons came from the Austin Federal Courthouse, printed in heavy black ink that made even Thomas's name look guilty. He had spent the week rehearsing his innocence in front of the mirror, practicing calm expressions, trying on the language of honesty like a new suit. I didn't say much. I simply carried the Whitaker binder in my leather briefcase, each section divided by color. Blue for bank records, yellow for property, red for hidden debts. It looked ordinary from the outside, but inside it contained the slow anatomy of deceit, categorized and balanced. The courtroom was cold, colder than I expected. Thomas's attorney, a man named Pierce, smiled politely at me before taking his seat. Across the aisle, the IRS representative set up a laptop and a stack of exhibits. The judge entered. "We are here to determine the legitimacy of the reported income and business expenses of Mr. Thomas Keene," he said. Thomas straightened, smiling like he was on a talk show. "Absolutely, Your Honor. I have nothing to hide." Pierce began by describing Thomas as a misunderstood businessman. He spoke of entrepreneurship, of risk and reward, of how every successful investor takes bold chances. "My client has been unfairly portrayed," he said. "These transactions were ordinary, and his wife's binder is simply a misunderstanding." I didn't look at Thomas while he spoke. Instead, I opened my binder, flipping to the blue section. The pages glowed under the courtroom light, printouts, statements, emails, each date aligned like soldiers. The IRS agent nodded for me to proceed. Mrs. Whitaker, the judge, said, "What do you have to present documentation?" I replied. Pierce laughed lightly. "Documentation. Your honor is easy to compile when you're motivated by revenge." The judge raised a brow. "Continue, Mrs. Whitaker." I walked to the projector, my heels clicking against the tile. I connected a flash drive and opened the first exhibit, a screenshot of an email Thomas had sent to his assistant. The subject line read, "Transfer from D's 401k to TK LLC." The date was clear, the signature his. A hush filled the courtroom. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Keene, did you authorize this transfer?" Thomas swallowed. "That was for investment purposes," he said quickly. "Short-term liquidity." My wife agreed. "Did you?" the judge asked me. I shook my head. "Not the person he married, Your Honor." Laughter rippled quietly through the spectators before the judge called for order. The IRS agent continued showing how the funds had moved from my retirement account into his company, then into a second account under the name of Chelsea Moore. Each slide built upon the last like an equation solving itself. I didn't need to raise my voice. The numbers spoke fluently. Thomas's lawyer tried to pivot. "Your Honor, these transfers may look questionable, but they were temporary. My client repaid everything." The agent tapped her screen. No repayment was recorded. The silence that followed was thick enough to taste. Reporters scribbled notes. A photographer from the Austin Chronicle snapped a picture of the binder resting open on the witness stand. Later, the article would read, "Local investor under IRS probe. Wife's binder reveals pattern." Thomas shifted in his chair. "You're doing this to humiliate me," he whispered across the aisle. I didn't respond. Humiliation wasn't the goal. Clarity was. The judge turned to me. "Mrs. Whitaker, why did you begin collecting these records?" I looked directly at him, because the math stopped making sense. He nodded. "And how long have you been keeping them?" 3 years, I said. "Color-coded, for efficiency." A faint smile touched the judge's face before he composed himself. "Continue." I opened the yellow section next property records, mortgage statements, vehicle titles. These assets, I explained, were purchased using joint funds, but registered under Mr. Keene's name only. He then used them as collateral for loans to his LLC. The judge flipped through the copies. "And did he inform you of this, no, Your Honor?" Pierce interjected. "She's exaggerating. My client intended to surprise her with profits." "Surprise," I said quietly. "Like the car?" Thomas's head jerked up. "What car?" "The SUV," I said. "The one I now legally own." Paid in full, by the way. A few people in the gallery smiled. Even the clerk coughed to hide a laugh. Thomas's face turned a deep shade of red. "Order," the judge said, but there was amusement in his tone. "Let's stay on topic." The IRS agent introduced the red section of the binder next. This part, she said, documents hidden debts, credit cards, false donations, forged invoices. Each connects directly to TK Investments. "That's absurd," Pierce snapped. "These are personal matters, not federal crimes." The agent looked at him evenly. The funds crossed state lines. Thomas fidgeted, his confidence dissolving. He wiped sweat from his temple, whispered to Pierce, who whispered back with the look of a man realizing the ground beneath him had vanished. The judge asked again, "Mr. Keene, do you have any explanation for these transactions?" Thomas opened his mouth, closed it, then stared at me as if I'd spoken a language he couldn't understand. "She set me up," he said finally. "She's vindictive." I turned toward him and said, "I'm an accountant. I'm accurate." A few people laughed again, and even the judge didn't bother to hide his smirk this time. After hours of testimony, the judge leaned back in his chair and said, "The court finds sufficient evidence to proceed with a full investigation into TK Investments and related entities. All associated accounts are to be frozen effective immediately." The sound of the gavel struck like punctuation on a long equation finally balanced. Thomas's mouth opened, but no words came. His attorney stared at the table. I closed the binder carefully and slipped it back into my briefcase. As we left the courtroom, the reporters crowded near the steps. Microphones appeared like thorns. "Mrs. Whitaker, did you know he was under investigation?" one asked. "I knew the numbers," I said. "They never lie." Another reporter asked, "Is this revenge?" I paused, meeting the camera lens. "No," I said softly. "It's just the balance coming due." That evening, the Chronicle published the headline across its website. Comments flooded in, some sympathetic, some gleeful, all fascinated by the image of a middle-aged accountant dismantling her husband's empire with a binder and patience. Friends texted me screenshots. One said, "You're famous." I replied, "No, I'm free." At home, the house was silent. Thomas hadn't returned. His side of the closet was half empty. I walked to my office, placed the binder on the shelf, and stared at it for a long moment. The colors looked almost beautiful under the lamplight, blue, yellow, red. The anatomy of deceit finished and filed. When I finally sat down, I opened my notebook and wrote one sentence. Public exposure completed, interest collected. Then under it, in smaller letters, justice is quiet. It does not shout, it simply adds up. The order was read in a voice that made the air itself seem still as stone. And when Judge Hart lifted his eyes over the rim of his glasses, I knew the arithmetic of the last 3 years was about to be spoken aloud. He set a folder on the bench, opened it slowly, and began to read line by line as if tallying a final ledger. Transfer from retirement account to TK Investments, $210,000. Consulting payments with no documented service, $186,000. Property equity siphoned through collateral loans, $742,000. A cascade of withdrawals labeled charitable gifts with no receipts, $84,000. The list went on until numbers lost their warmth and became a climate. Thomas sat very straight, a smile fixed to his face the way paint dries on a wall that is already cracking. Pierce kept one palm flat on the table, as if he could hold the floor steady by force. I kept my hands folded and my breathing even. The clerk recorded each line in a monotone that reminded me of a metronome. When the reading reached the end, the judge said the total with the care of a surgeon, $4,003,672. The room did not move. Then the gavel came down, and the sound rang like a lid, sealing ajar. Account frozen pending investigation. Pierce stood so quickly his chair skidded and bumped the rail. "Your Honor," he said, "my client manages funds for a network of investors who will be irreparably harmed. These assets are fluid. This freeze is excessive." The judge did not blink. "Excessive describes the pattern I have just read. Sit down." Thomas swiveled toward me, then his jaw tight. "She ruined me." He hissed low but clear enough for the front row. The words slid across the table like a cheap knife. I held his gaze until I saw it waver. "You did that the day you said for our future," I replied. The gallery rustled and then fell still as if a breeze had visited and gone on its way. The bailiff began distributing copies of the order to counsel and the IRS representative. Pierce tried once more, asking for partial relief, a limited release for basic operations. Judge Hart shook his head. "Nothing moves without court permission. You will produce records, names of principals, and proof of any legitimate obligation, if such proof exists." Reporters waited in the back, their pens already writing the headline. I could feel the shape of it without turning to look. Local investor under federal review assets frozen after spouse provides comprehensive documentation. The phrase sounded antiseptic, and yet to me it was a hymn. Pierce leaned toward Thomas and whispered hard. Thomas nodded, then shook his head, then nodded again, a man trying to negotiate with water. He lifted his hand. "Your Honor," he said, "I would like to address the court." "You will do so through counsel," the judge answered. "Your filings will speak for you. If they cannot, silence will." The judge signed the final page and handed it to the clerk. We were done. The hearing that had once seemed like a distant mountain had been crossed, and the descent felt steeper than the climb. I closed my binder and stood. The leather felt cool and honest in my hand. In the hallway, the ceiling lights hummed, and the air smelled faintly of copier toner. A cluster of microphones formed a small fence near the elevator. A young reporter with a steady voice asked the first question, "Mrs. Whitaker, how do you feel about the ruling?" I thought of all the nights I had sat counting and recounting the way a person traces a scar. I thought of the keys to the SUV resting in my bag, a reminder that paperwork can be both shield and sword. I thought of my mother who had taught me to keep my receipts even when love told me not to. Then I looked at the reporter and answered, "I balance things for a living." The group chuckled, and for a moment the tension that had wrapped itself around the day loosened like a knot that finally understood it was rope. Another reporter stepped forward. "Is this revenge?" "No," I said. "It is reconciliation. The numbers and the truth are finally in the same room." Behind me, Pierce guided Thomas down the corridor like a handler walking a furious animal past a line of children. Thomas stopped and turned. His voice rose now that the judge was no longer present. "You think you won because you embarrassed me. You think this makes you righteous." I did not answer. Righteousness is not a word you say into cameras. It is a weight you carry when no one is watching. The elevator arrived and I stepped inside. As the doors closed, I caught one last glimpse of him, the expensive suit, the polished shoes, the face that had learned to move in sympathy while the heart kept its own agenda. For a second, I almost remembered the man who had brought coffee to the hospital, who had said, "I will make sure your mother never worries again." Memory has soft hands, but I had learned to count with both hands open. Outside, summer heat pressed against the courthouse steps. I stood for a while and breathed the warm air as if it might contain some plain element I had been missing. Cars murmured on the street, and an ambulance wailed and then faded the city, doing what cities do not, caring about our personal arithmetic. My phone buzzed with messages, friends sending hearts and exclamation points, colleagues sending quiet congratulations. One text from an unknown number read, "You will be sorry." I deleted it without replying. Threats are just overdrafts written in anger. They bounce. I walked to the parking lot with my binder against my side like a companion. The asphalt radiated heat. When I reached the SUV, I paused, placed the binder on the hood, and smoothed the cover as if it were a tablecloth before a meal. The surface reflected a clean version of the sky. I unlocked the door and slid in. For a long minute, I sat without starting the engine. The silence felt earned. I thought about the next steps, the new accounts I would open, the workshop I wanted to build for women who'd been told to trust and to stop asking questions. I would show them how to ask the kind of questions that live on paper. I would teach them that a ledger can be a diary that tells the truth without adjectives. When I finally turned the key, the radio came on in the middle of a song I had loved in college. The singer held a note a fraction longer than expected, and that small refusal to hurry felt like the perfect benediction. I pulled out of the space and drove slowly toward the exit, careful, precise, as if the act itself was a signature. At the light, I glanced up at the courthouse dome. Somewhere inside the order sat cooling like bread on a rack, $4,003,672, a number with a body, a number that could be box labeled preserved until the truth sorted it. The light turned green. I pressed the pedal. I did not feel triumphant. I felt aligned. The account was frozen. The story was moving. The math had finally learned to speak in my language, and from now on I would let it do most of the talking. 3 months after the hearing, the air in Austin had shifted from summer's blaze to something softer. I had learned to wake without checking my phone, to sleep without rehearsing old arguments. The investigation was ongoing, the accounts frozen, the headlines fading. Life had begun to settle into its new rhythm when my phone rang one afternoon. The name on the screen made me pause. Thomas. I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering. His voice was different now, thinner, smaller. "Diane, can we talk?" he said. "I am broke." I stared at the sunlight spilling across my desk. It struck me as poetic that he called me now, not when the court order was read, not when the papers hit the Chronicle, but now when every safety net he had woven from my trust had unraveled. "Of course," I said. "Coffee. Tomorrow at 11. The cafe was quiet, all wood and brass, the kind of place where conversations are meant to sound civilized, even when they are autopsies. I arrived early, ordered an iced latte, and sat by the window. When he walked in, I barely recognized him. His suit hung loose, his tan gone, his eyes darting like he was scanning for exits. He smiled as if that might still work. "You look well," he said, sliding into the seat across from me. "I am," I replied. "You trying to be," he said, rubbing his hands together. "It has been rough. They froze everything. The IRS, the court, even my brokerage accounts. I can't access a dime." "That tends to happen after federal rulings," I said. He winced. "I deserve that. But Diane, listen. This can still be fixed. They are saying if I can cover part of the liability, they will ease the restrictions. If you could just unlock some funds, maybe unlock," I repeated, like I'm a password. "You know what I mean?" he said quickly. "You have money. You have control. I just need help until this is sorted. I will pay you back." I stirred my drink slowly, the ice circling like thoughts I had already finished. "You said that before. For our future, remember." He leaned forward. "Please. This is different. I am asking, not taking. That's progress," I said. The waiter appeared. "Can I get you something, sir?" "Just coffee," Thomas said, forcing a smile. "Black. No sugar." When the waiter left, he sighed heavily. "I lost my clients. Chelsea left town. The house is on the market. My lawyer wants another retainer I can't afford. You should have kept your receipts," I said. "Diane, I am serious. So am I." For a long minute, neither of us spoke. The cafe hummed around us, the low murmur of people who didn't know their lives could collapse in decimals. I watched him try to meet my eyes. He looked like a man auditioning for forgiveness without knowing the lines. "I know I hurt you," he said finally, "but we were partners once. Doesn't that mean anything?" "It means we shared a ledger," I said. "You just didn't like how the columns turned out." He swallowed hard. "I don't have anywhere else to go." "That's not true," I said. "You have creditors." The waiter returned with his coffee. I reached for the bill before Thomas could move. "I've got it," I said. One last courtesy. I handed over a card from my wallet without thinking. It was the old joint credit card, the one we had used for groceries and vacations before I moved everything to my own account. I had kept it as a relic, never expecting to use it. The waiter swiped it and returned with an apologetic smile. "I'm sorry, ma'am." "Declined." Thomas went pale. "That can't be right. Looks like your assets are on vacation," I said lightly. The words slipped out before I could stop them. The waiter hid a grin and left. Thomas's mouth opened, closed, then opened again. "This isn't funny. It's poetic," I said. "You spent years treating trust like currency. Now the currency refuses you." He leaned back defeated. "So that's it. You are just going to watch me fall." "You built the ladder," I said. "You chose how high to climb." He rubbed his temples. "Diane, please. Just unlock something. Anything. I can't even pay rent next month." "You had a house," I said, "and a car, and several LLCs. You could have kept any of them if you had valued transparency half as much as appearances." "I'm not your enemy," he said softly. "No," I said. "You're a lesson. There's a difference." He looked at me, then really looked as if trying to find some trace of the woman who used to sign checks in his name. Maybe he saw her. Maybe he didn't. But I saw him clearly for the first time, not the man who had impressed my mother, not the charming fundraiser, not even the arrogant husband who pawned his own watch, just a man reduced to the arithmetic of his own choices. I finished my drink and stood. "Take care, Thomas." He reached out instinctively, his fingers brushing the edge of my sleeve. "Diane, please." "Don't go. I'm not your bank, Thomas." His hand fell away. I walked to the counter, paid cash, and left a tip large enough to make the waiter raise an eyebrow. When I turned back, Thomas was staring at the declined card lying on the table. He looked smaller, quieter, almost transparent. Outside, the afternoon sun felt sharp and honest. I stood on the sidewalk and watched a delivery truck pass its side painted with the words, "Reliable Transfers." I laughed under my breath. Life had a sense of humor after all. At the end of the block, a woman was teaching her daughter to ride a bike. The child wobbled, fell, laughed, and tried again. Balance, I thought. That is all any of this ever was, finding balance after someone tilts the scales. My phone buzzed as I reached the car. A text from Thomas. Just 3 words. "Please forgive me." I typed back. "Not yet." Maybe never then, deleted it before sending. Some answers belong only to the air. I drove home with the windows down. The sky was wide and blue, the kind of blue that looks new even when it isn't. At a red light, I checked my reflection in the mirror. My face looked calm, older, but not tired. I realized I didn't need revenge anymore. The system had done the math for me. That night, I filed the cafe receipt in the Whitaker binder under a new tab I labeled Audacity Return. Beside it, I wrote a neat pen declined card, Emotional Balance Achieved. The first class met on a Saturday morning in a borrowed library room that still smelled faintly of old paper and lemon cleaner. 12 women sat in a semicircle, their notebooks stacked in front of them like shields. The sign on the door read, Second Ledger Project. I had printed it the night before, bold letters on plain paper, no decoration. I wanted it to feel solid, not sentimental. This was not a support group. It was a reclamation course. I began by writing a single sentence on the whiteboard. Balance is not revenge, it is recovery. The women watched in silence. Some nodded, some blinked hard. Most just waited. Then I said, we start with numbers because numbers tell stories before words can. A woman in her 60s with silver hair spoke first. Her name was Helen. She said quietly, he drained my account too, not all at once. Just enough to keep me from leaving. The sentence trembled, but it didn't break. I smiled. Let's freeze that kind of man next, I said, and the room exhaled a laugh that was half joy and half release. Humor has a way of disinfecting pain. We spent the morning drawing ledgers. Each woman listed her accounts, her income, her debts, and then wrote beside them one more column labeled sanity. I told them to record every time they said yes when they wanted to say no, every time guilt cost them interest. By lunch, the board was full of small epiphanies, written in ink. During break, a younger woman named Priya approached me with coffee. She was 30, a software analyst, newly divorced. She said, I watched your hearing on YouTube. You made spreadsheets sound like poetry. I laughed. They are poetry when they survive fire. The afternoon session was practical. We reviewed credit unions' power of attorney emergency savings and how to recognize financial grooming before it blooms. When I spoke about documentation, I held up my old binder. This is what clarity looks like, I said. Blue for bank records, yellow for property, red for hidden debts. The women leaned forward as if I were holding a relic. I told them it was not magic. It was just consistency given time to grow teeth. At 3 o'clock, I gave them an exercise called the Future Ledger. Each woman wrote what she wanted her next balance to include: security, peace, autonomy. One woman added laughter, and everyone smiled. Near the end, Helen raised her hand again. She said, I thought I was too old to start over. I said, you are not starting over, you are starting correctly. She nodded, pressing a tissue to her eyes. When the class ended, no one moved immediately. They lingered, trading phone numbers, comparing notes, laughing softly. It sounded like a new kind of choir. I gathered the binders they had filled and promised to scan and return them next week with feedback. The room emptied slowly until it was just me and the quiet hum of the air vent. I erased the board but left one phrase visible. Let's freeze that kind of man next. It was funny and fierce and true. Outside, the sky was pale gold. I walked to my car carrying the binders in a canvas bag. Each one weighed a little more than paper. Each was a small testament that arithmetic can become armor. Over the next months, the project grew. Churches lent rooms, a local bank sponsored financial literacy nights, and one of my old colleagues built a website. We called it Community Ledger. We uploaded templates, guides, and a forum where women could post questions anonymously. By December, we had over 2,000 members. I received letters, too. Some handwritten, some typed, all carrying the same undercurrent of relief. One read, "I thought shame was my inheritance until I learned to balance it." Another said, "My ex called me bitter." I told him bitter is a flavor, not a sentence. I pinned that one on the bulletin board. One afternoon, a journalist from the Chronicle visited. She was the same one who had covered the trial. She asked, "What changed for you after everything I said? I stopped counting losses and started counting lessons." She smiled. "That will be your headline." The article came out a week later, From Binder to Beacon. Local accountant turns pain into project. Donations arrived. Invitations followed. I declined most. I preferred teaching in small rooms where I could see every face. During one session, a woman asked, "Do you ever miss him?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about the cafe, the declined card, the look on his face when numbers stopped obeying him. I said, "Sometimes I miss who I thought he was. But that's nostalgia for fiction. It fades when you learn the real math." The class laughed softly, understanding. I realized then that healing was not a straight line. It was a ledger that sometimes balanced only after several pages. On the anniversary of the audit, I returned to the courthouse steps. I sat on the same bench where the reporters had once crowded. The building looked smaller now, like a house seen from a hill. I opened a small notebook labeled Year 2 and wrote, "The account remains frozen. The heart does not." A text buzzed from Helen. She had just opened her first solo account. Her message said simply, "Deposit made." I replied, "Interest guaranteed." That evening, as I closed my laptop, I thought about my mother. I wished she could have seen this version of me, the one who learned that justice is not always loud and balance is not always about numbers. It is about standing still in the truth and calling it enough. Before bed, I lit a candle on the kitchen counter, the same spot where Thomas once signed fake receipts. The flame flickered bright and steady. I whispered, "Here's to ledgers that stay honest." The house was quiet except for the soft ticking of the clock. I felt peace the way accountants feel, closure precisely, completely. Tomorrow there would be another class, another woman with another story of loss and recovery. We would sit together, write the numbers, and turn silence into documentation. And somewhere between decimals and laughter, we would keep freezing the kind of men who confuse control with love. It began with an email at 7 in the morning. The subject line read, "United States vs. Keene." The sender was the assistant to Judge Hart, and the attachment was a scanned order stamped in blue. I did not open it immediately. Instead, I poured coffee, watched the steam curl, and waited until the quiet of the house felt steady. Then I clicked. The document was short, only 5 pages. Thomas Keene was being formally indicted for tax fraud, wire fraud, and falsifying financial statements. The audit had evolved into prosecution. The numbers I had assembled had turned into evidence. The paper war was finally over, and the reckoning had begun. The news spread fast. By noon, the Chronicle posted the headline, "Local Investor Charged with Multi-Million-Dollar Fraud." By evening, cable networks replayed clips from the courthouse, the same hall where I once stood silent beside my binder. They called him a fallen entrepreneur, a symbol of arrogance dressed as ambition. I watched only once. The rest of the day, I turned off the television and worked on lesson plans for the next workshop. Justice had its rhythm, and I had mine. A week later, I received another message, this time from the Federal Restitution Office. The government had seized multiple properties and accounts. After settlement, I would receive $420,000 in restitution and accrued interest. I read the number twice, not for greed, but for symmetry. It felt poetic that the same system he had used to drain me was now refilling what was rightfully mine. I sent a short thank you email to the officer handling the case. She replied with a single sentence, "Your records made this possible." That night, I allowed myself one indulgence. I opened a bottle of the same Chardonnay Thomas had once refused to buy because it was, in his words, unnecessary luxury. I poured a glass, sat by the window, and thought about how strange it was that survival could look like peace. The city outside glowed quietly, traffic moving like veins of light. I lifted the glass slightly as if to toast the version of myself who had once believed that love and trust were the same currency. She had learned the hard way to keep separate accounts. The next morning, the Chronicle published a follow-up article. Judge credits meticulous records for conviction. The first line read, "Without Mrs. Whitaker's detailed documentation, the extent of financial misconduct might never have been uncovered." I stared at those words until they blurred. It was not pride I felt, but validation, the rare alignment of truth and recognition. Thomas's house was foreclosed that same month. Photos circulated online. Empty rooms, half-packed boxes, a grand piano covered in dust. His employees resigned, the firm dissolved, and his name disappeared from the Austin investor circuit. I did not celebrate, but I did not grieve either. The world was simply correcting itself. Reckoning like accounting was just truth written in columns. One evening, while sorting workshop materials, I found an old folder labeled Personal Miscellaneous. Inside was a photo from our wedding day. He was smiling, confident, hand resting on my shoulder. I looked at my own face in the picture and saw something different now. Not innocence, but optimism. The belief that partnership meant safety. I slid the photo back into the folder and wrote a note across it in pencil-closed account. Days passed quietly. Then one afternoon, an idea visited me, small and mischievous. It was not revenge, exactly more of a punctuation mark. I went to the florist down the street, the one that still wrapped bouquets in brown paper instead of plastic. I asked for white lilies. The woman tied them carefully, her hands steady and sure. When she asked for a message, I hesitated only a second before writing on the card for our future, now fully audited. I addressed the envelope to Thomas's attorney's office. The clerk asked if I wanted a return address. I said no. When the receipt printed, I folded it neatly into my binder under a new tab labeled Closure. Later that week, I received a brief text from an unknown number. It said, "You really sent flowers. I did not reply." Silence was more eloquent than words. The trial concluded within 3 months. Thomas accepted a plea deal. 18 months suspended sentence, 5 years probation, mandatory restitution to all victims, and prohibition from managing any financial entity. The official record described it as lenient. I saw it as precise. When the ruling was read, I did not attend. I was teaching a class that morning. While the judge spoke, I was explaining compound interest to a group of women at a community center. Integrity compounds better than any interest, I told them, quoting Judge Hart's words from months before. They laughed, some taking notes, others nodding as if they already understood. That was the only audience I wanted. A local station later aired footage of Thomas leaving court. He kept his head down, escorted by his lawyer. Reporters shouted questions. He said nothing. The silence that once belonged to me now belonged to him. When the restitution finally arrived, I deposited it in a separate account under the name Balance Restored Fund. I used part of it to expand the Second Ledger project printing materials, renting space, and offering scholarships for women who could not afford fees. The rest I left untouched. Money, after all, was just a medium for meaning. Months later, a letter arrived from the Bureau of Prisons notifying me that Thomas had completed his community service hours. The signature at the bottom was his. It read, "I'm sorry for the harm I caused. No excuses, just acknowledgement." I read it once, folded it, and placed it in the binder under Red Tab Debt Settled. It stayed there not as forgiveness, but as record. On the anniversary of the first hearing, I returned to the courthouse again. This time, the steps were empty. I stood beneath the columns holding a single white lily. I placed it on the ledge by the entrance and whispered, "Balance achieved." Walking away, I felt lighter, not because he had fallen, but because I had stopped carrying him. Every document, every calculation, every quiet decision had led to this equilibrium. Justice was not about triumph. It was about precision. That night at home, I opened my ledger one last time. On the final page beneath the last line of figures, I wrote 3 words account, reconciled completely. Then I closed the cover and let it rest on the table. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. It sounded like timekeeping accurate books. I turned off the light, stood at the window, and looked out at the city that had once felt so large and indifferent. Now it simply felt fair. A year later, the morning light over Austin felt different, softer somehow, as if even the sun had learned the value of restraint. I woke early as I always did and brewed my coffee the same way I had for 30 years, precise and unhurried. The house was quiet, a quiet that used to ache but now simply breathed. On the kitchen table sat the Whitaker binder, its edges worn smooth from years of handling. I no longer needed it, yet I kept it close, not as armor, but as proof that order could rise from chaos. I opened it one last time. The pages smelled faintly of ink and dust, like an old promise finally fulfilled. The final entry stared back at me in my own handwriting, balance, peace achieved. For a long moment, I just looked at the words. They were simple, almost ordinary, yet they carried the weight of everything that had come before: the lies, the courtrooms, the silence, the slow rebuilding of a life measured not by what was taken, but by what remained. On the wall above my desk hung a framed quote in black lettering. Judge Hart's words, the ones that had anchored me through the storm integrity compounds better than any interest. I had copied them from the court transcript and printed them myself. They were my daily audit, a reminder that dignity once reclaimed accrues quietly. Outside, the neighborhood was waking. A jogger passed by with a golden retriever. Children laughed somewhere down the block. A delivery truck hummed in the distance. Life had a rhythm again, unspectacular, but steady. I had stopped checking news about Thomas months ago. His name no longer appeared in headlines, and I had no reason to seek it. The ledger between us was closed. Instead, I spent my days teaching. The Second Ledger project had grown beyond anything I had imagined. We now partnered with local credit unions, hosting weekend clinics for women learning to navigate finances after loss or divorce. Every session felt like adding a new line of equity to the world. When the participants left, their smiles carried the same quiet satisfaction as a reconciled account. On Thursdays, I volunteered at the library where it had all begun. The same room, the same smell of paper and lemon cleaner. Sometimes new volunteers asked why the project was called Second Ledger. I would smile and say, "Because everyone deserves a clean balance sheet." They usually nodded, not realizing how literal that once was for me. One evening, as I was leaving class, a woman stopped me in the hallway. She looked about my age, maybe older. She said, "I watched your story online last year. It gave me courage to open my own case. My husband had hidden accounts too. We are still in court, but I am not afraid anymore." She pressed my hand gently before walking away. I stood there for a long moment, letting the weight of her words settle. That I thought was the true restitution. At home, I had simplified everything. No more joint accounts, no more deferred dreams. I tracked my spending in a single spreadsheet named PeaceLedger.xlsx, and every month when I balanced it, I smiled. I even started a small garden on the balcony growing herbs and tomatoes. Numbers taught me structure, but plants taught me patience. Both required care, and both, when tended properly, returned more than they took. One Saturday morning, while cleaning the drawer by my desk, I found the old cafe receipt from that day with Thomas. The ink had faded, but the amount was still visible, $14.60. I almost threw it away, then decided to keep it. It was not a reminder of him, but of the moment I realized I no longer needed to explain my worth to anyone. I slid it back into the binder under the tab labeled Audacity Return. That night, I sat by the window with a glass of wine, the city lights flickering below. Somewhere a church bell rang the hour. I thought of my mother and how she used to balance her checkbook with the same devotion others reserved for prayer. I finally understood why. Accounting at its heart is an act of faith, the belief that every loss can be reconciled, every imbalance corrected. I opened my journal and wrote one last entry. Year 2, April. The account of grief has closed. The dividends of peace continue. Then I closed the notebook and felt something loosen inside me. The story was complete. Before bed, I glanced once more at the quote on the wall. Integrity compounds better than any interest. The words glowed softly in the lamplight. I whispered, "Thank you, Judge Hart," and turned off the light. As I lay down, the world outside felt balanced again, somewhere between loss and laughter, between deceit and dignity, between the past and the present. I had found equilibrium. Justice had not been loud. It had been meticulous, patient, and quietly exact. If someone once told you it was for your future, did they mean theirs? Tell me below.